we were leaving a consultation group meeting. We must have been talking about couples therapy, and he just turned to me and he knew it was sort of a silly question to ask on the way out the door, literally. But he said, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" And I had given it some thought. And I first came up with a 5-word formula. I think basically if you boil it all down and oversimplify, what I'm telling people is be kind and don't panic. Because you can't be kind if you're panicking. And by kind, I don't just mean nice. We should all be nice. I mean kinship, that kind of treat this person as someone on your team. Well, you're going to do that, but you can't do that if you're in a panic.
Hi, I'm Kim.
And I'm Poncho.
And this is Now That You See It.
The show about the ideas hiding in plain sight.
The patterns underneath the patterns.
The stuff that quietly runs your life.
These are the conversations you can't stop thinking about.
And that you can't wait to send to a friend.
Because once you see it,
you can't unsee it.
Friends.
Hey, everybody.
Old and new. Welcome.
Yeah. Welcome to the show. Today, we've got another guest episode. Dr. Bruce Chalmer is joining us. Bruce, you're a couples therapist, but if you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience, what should they know about you?
Yeah, happy to. Well, as you said, I am a couples therapist. I've been a psychologist licensed for, my God, 30 some years now. And most of the last bunch of years, I don't know exactly how many, has been focusing on couples therapy. I also did a lot of work earlier in my career with people surviving trauma and, was trained in some of that, but ended up pretty much exclusively focusing on couples nowadays. And I just love that work. There's something so compelling, rewarding, difficult sometimes about doing work with couples, and I really just enjoy doing it. And I live in Vermont, which I really love living in. And my wife, Judy Alexander, and I do a podcast called Couples Therapy in 7 Words. I'm sure that perhaps that will come up in our conversation. And I'm not sure what else you'd like to know, but whatever else you'd like to know, let's talk about.
Yeah. Well, I would like to know, what have you seen that you can't unsee?
Yes. Yeah, and I knew you were going to ask that question, by golly, because I'm familiar with your podcast. Yeah, I guess what I came up with was the phenomenon that one can be in deep despair and come out of it, and it makes everything look different. The phenomenon of coming out of it, the fact that you can come out of it when you're in places of deep despair, and the gratitude one can have, not for the being in despair itself, but for what you learn by going through that process. It's incredibly inspiring. I'm sure that is a huge factor in why I have gone into the work I've gone into, which, wasn't my first career. I had an earlier career actually as a statistician, and I taught courses in data communications, and my PhD, actually before my PhD in psychology, I have a master's degree in statistics. So, I have a checkered career.
Bruce, you and I can have another podcast.
Oh, really? Yes. Are you in that field? One of those fields as well?
Yeah, in like nerddom. I'm a nerd. I'm a data nerd.
Oh, you're a nerd. Oh, you're a data nerd. Oh, yeah. Well, geez, we could nerd out. I mentioned that podcast that Judy Alexander, my wife, and I do. She's great at reining back. When I start nerding out, I'm like a recovering nerd with frequent relapses. And she's good at bringing it back. It's like, she's very nice about how she does it, but, maybe we should talk about things that regular people might actually want to hear. There's that. So she doesn't say it exactly that way, but she's very graceful about how she does it. We get along very well because of that. So
that's wonderful. Okay, great. Yeah. Great. Judy, I'm sure we will bring her on for a round 2. But today it's just you.
She would be delighted she wasn't available today, but yeah.
That's okay.
I feel like today we all stand the risk of just getting deep into the nerddom black hole and not having anyone to pull us out. But hopefully it's still useful and helpful for the listeners. Bruce, I'm curious about how you learned this, the idea that coming out of deep despair, you gain and you found appreciation for that, and it shifts the way that you see your life. You mentioned gratitude as something that comes out of that experience. How did you come by that? Was this a lived experience, something that you personally went through?
Yeah, it was way earlier in my life. Judy and I are a second marriage. And the very short story of my first marriage was that both my ex and I have gone on to marry really wonderful women, and we're both a lot happier. That's that's the short story.
I
But
love that.
yes, and that's how I like to tell it. And I like her wife. She's great. We're sort of like, family. I actually trained my ex's wife's kids for their bar and bat mitzvah before they were an item, when I was still actually married to my ex. Anyway, that's an old story. But
Wow.
one doesn't, especially in our
Wow.
generation, because I'm older. I'm 75, so I'm in our generation. That particular story, one didn't come to. I'm not saying that anybody comes to that easily, but it was. I think it was especially difficult.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
bump into that reality, and so again, without going into any details around that, there were times, because we had got together in high school, and I wasn't aware this is where things were headed.
Yeah.
And I wasn't prepared for it. And so as things developed in the course of that marriage, and it just got incredibly difficult, that's where the deep despair was coming from. And I just was not equipped for that.
Mm-mm.
And I remember a particular experience, just, not to get all mystical about it, but it was one of those experiences where, like early in the morning and like a sleepless night, and it just seemed like there was no feeling better. I remember the feeling in my stomach, and somehow the light dawned, literally and figuratively. Literally, it got to be daylight, but figuratively, it seemed like, no, there was hope in there somewhere. I don't know from where. If I were going to speak in sort of very traditional religious terms, which is not, I'm Jewish, but not sort of fundamentalist in my approach. But it would feel like, even in the depths of hell, God is there, that sort of thing. There was some kind of experience of, no, life is doable. Somehow it's right to be what it is, which is, by the way, how I define faith. I have come many years later, came to define faith that way, that life is right to be what it is. That's what I mean by faith. Something
Can you say
about
that
that
again?
experience.
Faith for
Yeah.
you is life is right to be the way it is.
Yeah. Even when it's painful, with all the crap, that that reality's right to be what it is. That it's not merely accepting reality, because you can sort of grit your teeth and say, oh, life's a bitch and then you die, that sort of expression. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying, no, even when it's really hard. Well, Viktor Frankl, life, man's search for meaning. I mean, in Auschwitz, he's saying, yeah, there's meaning here. This is pure evil. He's making no bones about that. Incredible suffering. And yet, at least you can find meaning in how you deal with it. There's meaning available, even in the worst of things. And that's what I mean by faith. And that experience, and I didn't use that word at the time. I didn't think of it that way, but whatever it was, that alerted me somehow. I had that experience of saying, wow, things can look so different. And then I actually got into therapy, and it's kind of funny looking back on it as a professional now. I mean, for many years, some of the therapy I got was good, and some of the therapy I got was really, really bad. Frankly, I was just not well done, but borderline unethical occasionally, whatever, but nevertheless powerful. That experience was powerful. And so I ended up kind of doing a mid-career correction and getting trained in clinical work, because I already had a PhD in psychology at that point from the research side. I'd been a statistician and ended up getting a PhD in psychology, but I got the clinical training after that, and then I got licensed, and I've been doing that ever since. And, that earlier work was sort of fun, but this work feels like a calling. This feels like, yeah, this is what I'm here to do somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So your experience of going through that despair is actually what directly led you to recognize you wanted the clinical training and that you wanted to do this kind of work.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially through the experience of being in therapy and seeing how powerful that can be.
Yeah.
And realizing there's something about this I think I want to be involved in. It's because it's so inspiring. Well, you're both both in the field as well. It's so inspiring to observe people struggling and bringing to bear their own wisdom, whether they know they have it or not, and the varieties of ways people manage to cope with really hard shit,
Yeah.
I don't know what the language code is on this podcast, but whatever.
It's welcome. Language
It's
is
welcome.
welcome.
Okay, good. Just saying. It's really inspiring to see that, and to have the privilege of being admitted into people's lives that way and invited to try and be helpful. It's incredibly inspiring. So yeah, that experience of my own kind of led me in that direction.
How Pancho and I are both trained in coaching from a positive psychology bent. And one of the things they teach you in positive psychology training is it's not toxic positivity. It's not happy talk. It's not the stuff that's like, God can't give you what you can't handle, and like look on the bright side, and
Right.
all these things that just
Yep.
speaking of one thing that we will talk about soon, which is the skill in a couple of being moderately annoyed. I imagine the people who are in the middle of despair would be more than moderately annoyed to hear, don't worry, there's a lesson here on the other side, there's meaning. Can you
Oh my
help
God, yes.
distinguish between the toxic positivity that you're not bringing, but like if you're in the middle, you could be like, F off, man, and what
Oh
this
yeah.
really is?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and that I love that notion. I don't know that I've used the term toxic positivity, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes, I very much distinguish that. I think I write about that in one of my books. That to tell people, well, God only gives you what you can handle, that kind of thing. Oh my God, what's fascinating to me is what seems to make a difference. Certainly has in my own life, maybe in yours, and certainly with the folks I work with, is not when you try to talk people out of how they're feeling, because that tends not to work. It just invalidates. I almost always start off by noting with the couples or the people I'm working with that it's actually in a context we'll probably get into later when we'll talk about by distinction between stability and intimacy. We'll probably get into that. But in the context of talking about stability, I will often say, it's funny, I was just earlier today, I was talking with a new couple and saying this very thing. I'll look at the clock and say, well, now that we're old buddies, because I've known you for 17 minutes, I can already tell something about the two of you that I'm pretty sure is true that relates to stability, which is neither one of you is batshit crazy. Is that accurate? And they'll laugh and I'll say, look, I don't want to make fun of serious mental health issues, but what I really mean is, you're not psychotic. You're not thinking the FBI is controlling the signals in your brain, so you're not crazy.
Which happens.
You're not. Yeah. Well, in 30 plus years, there've been fewer than a handful of folks that I haven't said that to, because they are, because it's, somebody, actually the FBI thing I got from somebody who said that was what was happening. They were just totally convinced. And, there's that kind of thing, which is pathological. I mean, it's like, okay, something's kerflooey, but the vast majority, if you use the technical term, look it up in the TSM.
I love that.
Yes. But the vast majority of folks I work with, they're not crazy, and they're not stupid, and they're not evil. None of the above. And so if they are suffering, they have good reason. And platitudes won't convince them that they're wrong for suffering. What will help is to actually recognize, wow, you have a basis for feeling this way. Let's find out more about it. But the faith that I'm conveying, and the faith that I'm more than anything else, I'm trying to embody it, is that sense that even when you're in the depths of despair, you're valid to be going through what you're going through. You're still a valid person. You can learn from this, even though it's incredibly difficult. But I don't gloss over the difficulty.
Yeah.
That does nobody any good.
Which reminds me of Kim and I have had conversations about two things that are pet peeves of mine. And it seems like there are some parallels to what you're saying. One is when people say everything happens for a reason.
I know, that drives me nuts. Yes.
It's similar to like God can't give you anything you can't handle, right? Well, where does that leave you with? It doesn't leave you with. So what and then the other one is the idea of yes lighting. So it's like gaslighting, but it's when somebody comes to you with a perspective that reality should be something other than what it is, and you agree with them. So in that sense, you are yes lighting them, right? You're reinforcing some belief that is completely out of touch. So what I'm hearing you say is, instead of doing that kind of stuff, you get people to find meaning in the reality that is actually happening to them by leaning into what is actually true.
And that is often a hard reality, especially in couples work.
Yeah.
And it'll often, I mean, I know it sounds sort of oxymoronic, but it's often funny. There's an absurdity, and I'm not laughing at people's pain. We will often all be laughing, sometimes a painful laugh, but recognizing some of the absurdity, like when they recognize, oh, one of my favorite things to note with people, one of the people I love to give a shout out to in the course of therapy. Do you know the name Jill Bolte Taylor? Do you know who she
Yes.
is? Yes, you
Yeah.
do. Yeah. You might recognize, and even if you don't know the name, her most famous TED Talk is My Stroke of Insight. She's this very quirky neuroscientist, and in her 30s had this massive left hemisphere hemorrhagic stroke, wiped out the functions of her left hemisphere largely for years, finally recovered enough so she could do things like write books and give TED Talks, And she wrote a book called My Stroke of Insight, gave this really fascinating TED Talk. Well, the reason I love to bring her up is she wrote a second book many years later, this is about 6-7 years ago, I think, called Whole Brain Living. And her basic thesis is we are all multiple people. And she's
It's
not
so good.
talking about dissociative identity disorder, although actually she does sort of map some of what she's talking onto that. And she also maps it onto internal family systems, Dick Schwartz's thing where there's all a bunch of us inside, but she says, no, physiologically, just, a neuroscientist, we're at least 4 different people based on left and right hemispheres and you sort of neocortex and limbic system. So, and she gives them funny names. And it's funny. I was talking to Judy about this when I was reading the book. She hadn't read the book, but I was saying, so I was explaining this idea. I said, and Jill Bolte Taylor says we should give our 4 characters funny names. So what would you call yours? She immediately said John, Paul, George, and Ringo, of course. Which we're boomers. I mean, yeah, perhaps I imagine you get the reference.
I get the reference.
But that there is something to that. There's something about the Beatles that they brought those 4 sort of funny intermeshing characters together in this one whole, and we all have those little parts in us. And the reason I bother saying that, though, where it gets, it sort of happens in couples therapy, is to recognize, oh, so when you said that, on the one hand, no, you actually did hate your partner, and you also loved your partner, and you were also terrified of your partner, and you were also, trying to figure out your partner. All of these things are happening simultaneously. And so when you say things, I love it when people say, well, I was angry. I didn't really mean that. Well, actually, the part of you that was saying it did mean that when you said it. It's just that that's not all you mean. You can simultaneously mean the opposite. You can mean all sorts of things. All of those are available. And when people get stuck in one interpretation, it closes everything down. And so to recognize that sort of multiplicity of available meanings and multiplicity of, we don't just have one attitude at a time. There are multiple ones. And it's good to know that because it allows for a little bit of room to maneuver when you're interpreting somebody's behavior. It doesn't have to be all one thing.
One of the things that we love to talk about here is nuance, gray area, getting out of the binary, out of this or that, which by the way, we also fall into often, even as people who are, seeking out the gray, like we'll find ourselves saying like, it's either that or that. And you're like, no. What's coming up here for me is this is your work is articulating the nuance and the gray of the in-between, the both and you've written books with the words paradox in them. And one of the things you shared with us is the 2 most important skills for a couple are inherently in conflict.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about that and how that like practically applies for couples you've seen?
Yes, I'd be happy to. And this is a little bit of a spiel that I give to almost every couple. I can't think of an exception in the last few years, actually. In the first session, I make a point of kind of giving this little, it's about a 6-7 minute talk about this stuff because it seems to be a light bulb moment for people. And in fact, last year when I wrote a book about this, kind of based on this very idea, I had to come up with a catchy clickbait sort of title. So I call it the Passion Paradox. But let me explain what that's about. Yeah, that it's one of the many ways of viewing, like, why do we couple up? Why do we do this? I mean, yes, we are mammals. and we reproduce sexually, but obviously there's all kinds of people who are coupling up and not reproducing or not for the purpose of reproduction. And besides which, all sorts of mammals reproduce just fine without forming couples. So what's the deal here? What are we trying to do? There's lots of ways of understanding that. But my favorite way is to recognize that when these two sets of needs are adequately fulfilled, a couple wants to stay together and feels good about it. I should put in the other, they feel good about it and therefore want to stay together. You know? So what are those two? Why do I say there are two sets of needs? Well, it's because of that conflict between them. And I'm using the word needs carefully here. I'm not talking about desires. I'm saying needs, that if these are not met sufficiently, something gets sick. Something isn't functioning. So what do I call the two sets of needs? Well, I call them stability and intimacy. So stability, that's the one, usually I'll say this to people, you're probably thinking something similar to what I'm thinking because I'm using the word in its usual sense. Stability just means it's not shaky. So it means you're not super anxious about it. I do recognize nobody ever makes a first appointment with me just to tell me how stable everything is. That's... I could get into a vaguely obscene joke about that, but I won't. But anyway,
no, let's hear it.
No.
Now I have to tell the joke,
Yeah,
the ridiculous joke. Sorry, it comes to mind. What can I tell you? I usually tell it in a Jewish context, although you can tell it doesn't have to be a Jewish context. Well, yeah, I'm Jewish, so it sort of comes that way. But it's the 90-year-old guy, 90-year-old Jewish guy. The only relevance of that is he goes to confession in a Catholic church, and the priest says, my son, what can I do for you? And the guy says, I just had sex with 3 25-year-old women. And the priest says, good heavens. Well, when's the last time you confessed? And the guy said, no, I've never been to confession. I'm Jewish. And the priest says, well, what are you telling me for? And the guy says, I'm telling everybody. What was the relevance of that? I don't know. How did I get there?
Pop into your head.
Yes, it just popped in my head. Anyway, yes. So the point being, what was the point? I'm sure there was a connection.
Doesn't matter.
There, but I don't know.
You got a joking. You got a good joking.
Got a good joking. So stability is that's right. Yeah, nobody makes an appointment with me just to tell me how stable everything is. That's what it was.
This guy tells everybody.
I'm telling everybody. No, you're not going to make an appointment with a couples therapist to say everything's fine. You just don't do that. So I recognize that. That said, like I said to the couple I saw this morning, most of the folks who consult me actually are pretty good at stability because the skills of stability are about being relatively predictable, relatively reliable. I think I commented in one of my books, I said, what you need for the character traits you need for stability are the boring trifecta. Responsibility, reliability, and accountability. They're all really important. I'm not knocking any of them. I want them, and I want my wife to have them. We should all be that way. Nobody's perfect in any of those areas, but we should all, fundamentally be that way. Because what that does is you can, count on somebody to show up when they say they're going to show up, and not be horrible to you, and be somewhat accountable. That if you want to complain about something, they'll listen to you. That's all about stability. Important stuff. The skills of stability are all about keeping the anxiety level low, avoiding it or keeping it low. Intimacy, however, here I better define my terms. What do I mean by intimacy? I mean it not just sex, for example. I mean it in a broader sense. Intimacy is when you are fundamentally present and honest with yourself and each other. You show up and you can say what you need to say, and you can hear the other person say what they need to say, and those are moments of intimacy. And look, no couple could be intimate 24/7. No human being could be intimate with the world 24/7. You get distracted. I'm not always present with myself, never mind someone else. But intimacy, I claim, is every bit as much of a need as stability. And the interesting thing is the chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety without freaking the fuck out. That's basically what the chief skill is. And people look at me funny, like Kim, you're sort of saying, what?
Yeah, well, I want you to say it again, because I don't want to blow by that. That's a big one. Yeah.
Yeah. The chief skill of intimacy is to tolerate anxiety without freaking out. And the reason I say that is, because people say, wait a minute, I thought intimacy is supposed to feel good. Isn't that associated with feeling good?
Without freaking the fuck out, right?
Without freaking the fuck out, as I said the first one.
Cool.
First time, that's true.
Great.
Just a little.
Want to make sure we get the definition
there.
just right.
Get the definition just right.
Excellent.
I don't always use that part of the definition. What can I say?
Yeah.
But the key being the willingness to tolerate anxiety and ability
Yeah.
to tolerate anxiety. And, why would intimacy involve anxiety? Well, it doesn't when it doesn't, right? When you're having a lovely moment of connection with someone, that feels lovely. That's not about anxiety.
Yeah.
The thing is, what if you want to do something as simple as a garden variety complaint? What if you just want to say, hey, I wish you wouldn't do, X, Y, or Z that you're doing, or I wish you would do X, Y, or Z that you're not doing, just raise something an issue you have with someone. That's going to raise anxiety, especially if you've tried that in the past and somebody's been offended or it's escalated, it's gone off the rails, then you get more and more afraid of doing that. So then people start, walking on eggshells, that kind of phenomenon. Or it's not just about complaints, though. It's also about things like, what if you want to describe a dream you've had of something you want to try, or especially in the sexual domain? What if you have some sort of fantasy and you want to share it with your partner, but you're worried they're going to think you're really weird if you share it, or you don't know how they'll react, or you want to try something, but you're not sure you want to try something, and you want to tell them or give them some feedback or something? All of that involves raising anxiety, again, especially acutely if it's gone badly in the past, which it often has with the folks I've worked with. And so all of that has the effect in stable couples, couples that do bizarre things like fall in love and then have children. And they not only have children, I don't know if you encounter this in the weird folks you work with, they not only have children, they actually give a shit about them. Have you noticed that? It's like, I've so often told people, if they just wouldn't give a shit about their kids, or even better, give them the Humane Society or something, then they wouldn't have nearly the problems they have. But they always say, no, they're just not going to do that. I
Totally
have
agree.
children and grandchildren myself, by the way. I just have to point that out. But no, I mean, it's, caring about your children, of course, ups the ante on stability. That's my point. And so what stable couples will tend to do is worry about rocking the boat.
Mm,
And the effect of that is to shut down or to
yeah.
attenuate intimacy. And because, and my basic thesis here is that intimacy is every bit as much a need. And my favorite metaphor, and this is where I usually conclude my little lecture, like I'm doing now. My favorite metaphor about stability and intimacy is, if you think about a seed that falls into fertile soil and it
Mm,
germinates and it sprouts and it starts to grow, and somebody comes along and paves a sidewalk over it. Now, why would they do that? Well, it makes it more stable, right? For at least for the people walking on it, it's more stable to walk on a sidewalk. That's great, but what's the plant going to do? The plant has roots for stability, but intimacy is the energy for growth. And what that plant is going to do is it will try and crack the sidewalk or die trying. And I claim the metaphor I'm using here, and I sometimes think it's not even a metaphor. It's like literally that, a couple is a living organism. Each of us is a living organism. A couple is a living organism, and it needs to grow. It needs to interact with its environment and grow. And if that is attenuated somehow the couple will try and crack the sidewalk. And what does that look like? What that looks like perhaps is an affair, often, not all. It's not the only reason people have affairs, but it's a biggie, especially if they're not like sort of, there are folks who have affairs because they really don't believe in monogamy, and even their partner does, and they figure, what they don't know would hurt them. But most of the folks I work with, that's not the case at all. An affair arises in a context where there is somehow a lack of intimacy. And I'm not blaming the victim here, but I'm just observing that's often the context, because they become vulnerable to, they're so thirsty for that, they'll find it somewhere else.
Totally.
Sometimes what it looks like to crack the sidewalk is arguing about everything and nothing, so that everything becomes an argument, no matter how innocuous it seems to be, because the arguments protect them from actually talking about what they're really terrified to talk about, which is the stuff they're worried about. The stuff that could actually break them up, or the stuff that they just can't handle, even though it's really bothersome. And sometimes it looks like somebody being blindsided, and they just all of a sudden say, I don't love you anymore. I don't think I ever loved you. I'm out of here. I've heard people reporting that that's what their partner said, or that's what they said. And that is often, again, symptom, quote, air quotes, a symptom of lack of intimacy. So that's kind of that's the passion paradox shtick.
I got to ask a big question last time. Don't you go?
Oh man. Um, I have two questions. One is more about me, but before I turn this on myself, I am curious about how something that we kind of glanced over, the idea that the skill that solves all relationships is the ability to be moderately annoyed. How does that
Mm.
tie into the a couple successfully navigating both the stability need and the intimacy need through moderate annoyance?
Yeah,
How do
yeah.
those things come together?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know that I've ever sort of explicitly made the connection, but I think it's pretty, at least in my brain, it's pretty clear. That is tolerance of anxiety. It means the same thing. That the idea that for someone to be able to be mildly or moderately annoyed, it's funny. We did a podcast on this. I just came up with it, I don't know, a couple of years ago when we had you'll relate to this perhaps. We had a guest lined up who didn't show. It turned out they had an emergency and we didn't know it. We were just sitting there waiting, and finally we realized, oh, they're not going to come. But we wanted to record a podcast for that week. So I said, ooh, I know. It's the one skill that solves all relationship problems. And Judy looked at me like said, oh, really? Like not too grandiose, And I said, no, let's do it. So we did. And that was what it was, because it's that idea that if you can, look, the one constant among all of us human beings is God knows we're all annoying. And we're all annoyed. And, I could say that in a funny way, but I also mean it in a fairly serious way. Who's the guy? I should look up his last name. I keep forgetting his last name. The guy whose first name is Alain, Alain. He's
Yeah.
American. I think he may say Alan.
Debaton?
Is he the
Alain
one?
de Botton?
School of Life.
Yeah.
The School of Life.
Yes. And he wrote a book called Why You Will Marry the Wrong Person.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Isn't
think
that a
that's
good
the
one?
one. And it's saying very similar things. He didn't use the same language, I don't think, but it's saying similar thing. And he's not cynical, he's not cynical about marriage or relationships. He's just saying whoever you get, it's a bundle of particular annoyances. And you present a bundle of particular annoyances to them. You're going to have to figure that out. And if you think, and people, well, I'm sure you realize this, people go into relationships often with the illusion that they found the perfect person who will never annoy them. And it turns out the perfect person is actually a person, except for the people who are dealing with AI, which never annoys them. But that would drive me nuts personally. Talk about yes lighting. Oh my God.
Mhm.
I've actually
Yeah.
made use of ChatGPT in helping me, um, like, design an ad campaign for, a video course and things like that. And I have to tell it not to be such a sycophant, it's yes lighting. It's like, no, don't always agree with me. And of course, it's not capable of that yet, thank God. So I just have to obviously take everything it says with a grain of salt. But
Yeah.
that phenomenon of recognizing that people can be annoyed and are annoying, if you tolerate that without crossing over into panic, saying, oh my God, I've got the wrong person here. Tolerating that and being relaxed about it when it's at that level of mild or even moderate annoyance, that's the skill, because then you're going to be able to look at someone you love who's also annoying you and just smile and say, I'm so grateful to have you in my life. I don't care that, it's funny. My go-to story is one, if Judy was here, she could tell it, because it was, we are a second marriage. I think I meant, well, yeah, so is she. And I think we had been married already for 2 or 3 years before she said, when you come out of the bathroom, I'd really like it if you would wipe down the sink, not leave it wet, like that. And, after brushing my teeth or something. And I said, oh, sure, no problem. But it took her, from her past experience, it took her several years to get up. She said it wasn't about courage. She wasn't worried about my reaction, but she didn't want to bother me with it. It's like, but it was a moderate annoyance. It was, mild annoyance. She finally said, well, I'm just going to say something. It's annoying. And of course, as soon as I heard it, it's like, well, sure. And the funny thing about that one was I then, as soon as she told me about it, I decided I didn't like it either. And I started doing it for myself. So it wasn't just for her anymore. I just internalized it. But that phenomenon of being able to be moderately annoyed and not panic. And I always love to point out in my own marriage that Judy needs that skill way more than I do, because I'm so much more annoying than she is. So she's the one who needs the skill of tolerating moderate annoyance more than I do, because she's just not annoying. But everybody needs that skill.
Yeah.
That's so good.
I mean, everything you're saying is a perfect segue into the second thing,
Mm.
which is that you're describing the majority of the couples you work with as being high on stability, low on intimacy. If
Yeah.
if I were to summarize that, put it in one sentence. My wife and I are the opposite.
Ah.
And it's mostly, I think, because of me.
Mm-hmm.
She is a very high stability individual. She's very conscientious, big five personality type. I would say she's high on the conscientious side of things, high on the neuroticism side of things. So she's always very much on top of things. Flip side, she carries low grade anxiety about a lot of things that I don't even register. Like, they're not blips on my radar. And Kim will attest to this. I am quite the opposite. I optimize for freedom. I have ADHD. I like to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And um and very early on in our relationship, having gone through a lot of other relationships and kind of learned what failed in those, I recognized that it was going to be really important to say the truth and to
Mm.
be able to sit with that mild panic of, oh, we're saying the truth. And then you talk through it. So for me, what you're calling intimacy, can you wipe down the sink after you're done brushing your teeth? Can you make sure you take out the trash when the trash can is full? Can you not burp loudly in the room when I'm in the room with you? Because like all of those little things, or also the really big things, like, hey, when you said that thing or when you did that thing, that actually triggered in me feelings of abandonment that have nothing to do with you, and something that I'm working through. Bringing up those things and talking through them. I mean, even just like alternative relationship structures, like and exploring what would it look like if we opened up our relationship.
Mm.
Um, talking about past sexual partners, which I know for some people can be, or talking about people we find attractive who are not a part of our
Mm-hmm.
marriage. Those are all like very high tension things. For me, the fact that we can have conversations about stuff like that feels like stability.
That's interesting. Yeah, you defined it as stability. Yeah, that
For
indeed.
me, that
I'm
feels
sitting
like
there
That's
love.
thinking, oh
really
yeah, that's
interesting.
intimacy. Yeah, no,
If
that's
we can
well,
go there and
Mhm.
yeah.
stay there and hear each other and understand each other and not have that feel like a moment to panic, that's stability.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I do want to note one of the pieces of this whole concept is lack of intimacy becomes destabilizing. So to say that sort of in the contrapositive in terms of what you're just saying, yes, the
Yeah.
fact that you guys are good at that is a stabilizing influence for sure. Because it means
Mm,
you don't freak out over things that inevitably come up. Differences come up, thoughts that hadn't occurred to you that are important to you come up. And the fact that you can handle those intimately indeed is, what should I say, not destabilizing, which is to say stabilizing. So that
right.
certainly makes sense. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then the interesting thing is the stuff that for two people who are more on the conscientious, what were the three words you used? Responsible, reliable, and
And accountable.
accountable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not as great at those things.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually how I destabilize our relationship. And she kind of counterbalances it, right? So for me, the mild annoyance is she's dealing with low grade anxiety, and the way that she behaves and the way that she communicates with me and the things that she's worried about, it's kind of annoying to me. She deals with low grade anxiety. She deals with mild annoyance when when I leave the dirty dishes in the sink and say I'll do it later, and
Mm-hmm.
then they're still there at the end of the night. I'll get to them eventually, but I'm not annoyed. She's annoyed. Or when, I got laid off in 2024, which is when I became a coach.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a bigger destabilizing influence on our financial health and kind of what's our future going to look like. She has a very stable job. I decided to say fuck it and switch careers. It's
Mm-hmm.
been it, and that's always I mean, it's been a tumultuous thing. I think for most people it is. So I'm the one who, I guess, in the way you framed it, kind of traditionally stable things, I'm the one who has trouble showing up in that way.
Yeah.
To what degree do you notice that in relationships that one person might create stability for the relationship on the intimacy dynamic, and the other person creates stability in the relationship on the what you defined as stability dynamic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess my first thought would just be that inevitably people are different from each other.
Sure.
That's a feature, not a bug of evolution, right? It's like, yes, we are attracted to people who aren't clones of ourselves,
Yeah.
which is good. That's good news. So the fact is, inevitably, if you look at people along those dimensions, you will find there is some degree of polarity, and sometimes those polarities will polarize. They will get more extreme simply because they point. It's the stuff that bothers you that you really notice. So
Right.
that stuff can actually, those definitions of you and your wife that came out of your experience together, that narrative of who you are and who she is, inevitably is oversimplified because there's no narrative that isn't. Do you know what I mean? So
Sure.
you're not only not responsible and she's not only responsible. Do you know what I mean? You both share lots of overlap because that's always true. But that said, yeah, people often sort of occupy one part or the other of that dichotomy. I mean, what I notice a lot though, all the stuff you were describing as sort of potentially destabilizing, and that I'm thinking of the reason I say the large majority of folks I work with are pretty good at stability. I've worked with lots of people who sound like you. You know what I'm saying? Who say similar things like that. It's folks where they're often looks like serious substance issues or things like that, where they simply can't. They can't put together 5 days of sobriety, and I'm not an alcohol counselor per se, but they can't put together enough days to have any sort of stability in the relationship, or
Right.
they are dealing with some sort of serious mental health issue, bipolar or something like that, which is incredibly destabilizing, or things of that sort. So that's what I think of when I think about folks who aren't already pretty good at stability, is the folks who are dealing with something like that is just inherently destabilizing.
It's interesting. We said that these are inherently in conflict.
Yeah,
They seem they seem to me, when done well, to go together perfectly.
yeah, yes,
What fe
exactly.
what feels true is that intimacy has to carry some tension and spice to which is not what people think of as stability. And
Yes.
that seems why they feel in conflict to many people of I can't have both stability and tension or conflict and tension and anxiety, tension and that you're walking up to a cliff and you either send the text or you say the thing and you're in that 3-second pause where the bubbles are bubbling on the thing and you're like, what are they gonna say? And you're
Uh-huh.
like, you're like Wile E. Coyote above the air and just like,
Yep.
am I gonna drop? That
Uh-huh.
moment seems to be the fuel that creates the life-giving tension in a relationship that you're talking about. Do I have that right? Would you add
Yeah,
anything to it?
yeah, absolutely. The willingness to take that risk. And that's the thing. So if what you're thinking you want for stability is no such feeling of anxiety, is just
Mhm.
safety all the time, that will not work ultimately, because that will lead to a life that will start to feel dead, because there's that other aspect of who we are that wants to grow. And growth inevitably means experiencing things, from a different point of view, or things you've never experienced before or something. And that means it's going to be a little bit more or a lot uncomfortable because you haven't experienced it.
Mhm.
But somehow organisms need that. They need to branch out and grow. And so indeed, yeah, but you're absolutely right. I think they work together beautifully when they work together, when you don't panic about it, when you can tolerate the anxiety of intimacy, that can give you a very stable relationship. A stable relationship that feels alive. That's
That feels
kind of,
alive. That's the thing,
yes.
like, this is not, like, passive intimacy. This is,
Oh
like,
no.
if it's working, it's uncomfortable
Yeah.
often,
It's
as a
not
regular thing.
constant. It can feel
Yeah.
ecstatic and it can feel
Mhm.
painful. It can feel everything in between, but it can feel. You
Yeah.
feel alive. You feel, and you feel like your existence is an adventure as opposed to something to be slogged through.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so often when people come to consult the likes of us, I think they are feeling very stuck, and some degree of despair often, because they've tried what they've tried and it just doesn't seem to get better, and they care. They don't want to. Usually the folks consulting me are not leading with wanting to split up. Usually that's not what they want. They want to find a way of wanting. It's funny. Often one person wants to stay together and the other person wants to stay together. They don't, they wish they wanted to stay together
Those are
because
not the same.
those are not at all the same. No, they're importantly different. And very often that is, not always, but very often that's what I'm seeing in a couple. That it's one of them, it's funny. I just released a course in discernment. I don't call it discernment counseling because it's a video course. But you familiar with that concept, discernment? It was Bill Doherty invented it many years ago.
Mm.
And
I'm familiar with it from like a religious perspective. I went to a lot of Catholic school. So there's a lot of
okay. I don't even know it from
discernment.
religious.
It's like,
Oh,
do you
what
want to
does
be a
that mean?
nun or not?
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Wow. That's from my Jewish
Yeah.
background that went
No,
over my
yeah.
head, but no, discernment in a counseling scenario. It's again, I think it's Bill Doherty. He probably grew up Catholic, I imagine. Doherty. So I'm guessing. Do you know who he is? He's pretty well known couples therapist, and he's actually one of the founders of the group Braver Angels, which is a group that will have discussions like across the political divide. Really interesting guy. I don't know him personally, but I've read some of his stuff. But
That's so
anyway,
cool.
the concept of discernment, he invented a number of years ago, discernment counseling, where the whole purpose of the counseling, instead of saying, come here and let's see if we can help you feel better, it's let's focus just on the question, do you want to work on this or not? So in other words, there's basically three possible options. One is stay together and commit to staying together for some period of time. I don't usually suggest a given, like 6 months or whatever, some period of time. Stay together and work on it. Do what you can do, like couples therapy or something to make it better. Option two is just leave things alone and just say, you know what, we're not ready to do anything different. Let's just see what happens. Now that we've been here, let's see what happens. Option three is separate. So the purpose of the counseling is quite narrowly focused on that. Now, I don't do that usually per se with people. It often amounts to that, but I don't generally restrict it to that. But I did just come up with a video course that is essentially that it takes you through. And, what I claim in the course is by the end of chapter 3, you will be making a decision. But of course, why can I be so confident about that? It's how I define the decisions, because option 2 is don't do anything. So if you don't know what else to do, you have chosen option 2. So that, it's a little bit of sophistry, I suppose, to say, well, then, I know you're going to make a decision, but, you will, because if you don't do anything else, you've chosen one. You've chosen option 2. But ideally, you will choose either 1 or 3. And of course, my bias is toward 1, not 3. My bias is toward, I'll bet you if you work on it, you'll learn from working on it, even if you end up splitting up. That's, I actually, the way I approach this is I first define, very oversimplifying, I'm sure, but I define the distinction between deal breakers and growing pains. And deal breakers aren't defined by how severe they are. You can have incredibly severe growing pains that nevertheless aren't theoretical deal breakers. I'll tell you what I mean by what makes something a deal breaker is only if logically there's no possible solution where you could stay together and be okay. The classic deal breaker, 2 people who get together and one wants to have a child desperately and the other desperately doesn't. And they're not going to change their minds. And there's nothing wrong with either of those choices, but they are utterly incompatible. And I can't think of a way that a couple could resolve that and be okay unless one of them actually did change their mind. Well, of course, if you change your mind, you haven't got a deal breaker. But if that's the case, and you'd be amazed, or maybe you wouldn't, the numbers of couples I have met who have, like fairly young folks, says the old guy over here, childbearing age folks, who get together and they've been together 4 or 5 years and they haven't had that conversation, or they're surprised by the answer. Oh, have you been there?
Yeah. Yeah. This is a
Oh
podcast we
my.
haven't recorded yet, but yeah, it was,
Oh my.
yeah. And it was hard. It was a long 3-year conversation, that happened partially during COVID. So during an already emotionally tumultuous time. Um, but yeah, and I'm happy to go into it. I don't know if
I'm just sort of curious how it turned out, if you want to say.
Yeah. So I started dating Steph when we were in very different places in our lives. I was 28 and kind of a young professional building my life. I had just gone through through a process where I recognized that I didn't really know what I wanted in a significant other. I thought I did, and then I met that person, and she fell in love with my housemate who was living in the attic, worked 10 hours a
Ouch.
week, and didn't shower for 3 days straight. And so I realized, okay, clearly the person I really wants something else, right? And so that whatever I've been doing with this list of requirements for what my ideal partner looks like is not working. I need to throw that list out the window, and I'm going to go back to two criteria. Is this an attractive person? Do I find them to be attractive? I think that's really important in a relationship, especially as it's starting out. You have to physically be attracted to them. And two, is she kind?
Mhm.
And so um Steph was 21, and in the last quarter of her last year in college
Hmm.
when I met her, and she fit those two criteria. I never would have dated a 21-year-old college girl at 28
Mhm.
otherwise, but I was in this very open, see what happens kind of place. And even then, both of us thought it was just going to be a quick fling. She had plans to graduate college and move to Guatemala for an internship. And then she had told me she wanted to go work harvest in Australia after that. So in my mind, it was just like, okay, we're going to have some fun. She's going to leave, you know. Uh, but then she went to Guatemala and decided she wanted to come back because she wanted to
Mm.
be in the same place as I was. We'd kept in
Mhm.
touch even though there wasn't a commitment there was no titles when she was in Guatemala. We could theoretically both have gone off to meet and date other people. Um, and so our relationship started in a relatively unintentional way. We intended it to be one thing. We found that for whatever reason we really liked hanging out and talking, and so we didn't have the "do you want to have kids" conversation early on because we didn't see the point in having those kinds of conversations early on. And she was 21 coming out of college. She didn't know half of what she wanted for herself in her life. So it in a sense, it would have been asking for something that was too much to ask of somebody at that point. So 4 or 5 years later, we are now living together. We're in the middle of COVID, and the philosophy I brought to the table is, um, and I've changed my mind on this since, but I still do believe that to some degree, all of the major problems we deal with that seem like they are unsolvable fundamentally are a result of there being too many people on the planet.
Ah. Yeah.
And how we are as people, right? Just the way that like we inevitably can't seem to get out of our own way. So we can't seem to get out of our own way, and there are too many of us. So as we grow the number of people, the way in which we can't get out of our own way grows as well. And so knowing that there are a bunch of kids out there in the world who could benefit from having parents in a relatively privileged position, it didn't make sense to me to have my own children when I could go and adopt.
Mhm.
And she was at this point in her mid to late 20s and more grounded and able to consider whether she wanted kids. And she just grew up assuming she would have kids because that's what you do. You grow up, you
Mhm.
get married, you get a job, you have kids. And it was the first time when she'd had to really contend with a life in which the narrative didn't have her as a mom.
Mhm.
Um, and we both this is again coming back to, like not panicking when you have conversations like this.
Yeah.
We had already developed the habit of having conversations like this and being like, wow, I really understand where you're coming from. That makes sense. And I don't see it that way. And so we had 3 years of back and forth conversations of, yeah, I still don't want to have kids. I still don't want to commit to not having kids. I still want to hang on to this idea of having kids. And after a long time of thinking about it, talking about it with other people, talking about it with one another, um, she kind of started to realize maybe I've rubbed off on her. Having
Mhm.
kids it was going to be really fucking annoying and difficult for a lot of reasons, right?
Especially if your partner doesn't want to have kids,
right, sure,
for example.
Sure.
Yep.
But for her, like, she loves sleeping 9 hours a day. And she like could not fathom and there's times when she's just trying to have like introverted alone time, and our dog will go and sit in front of her and breathe really loudly because he wants attention, and she'd be like, get out of here, like, and she'll chase him out of the room and lock the door, and she like, well, you can't do that with a child, right? So she's starting to notice things about herself where it would be quite a challenge to be a mom. And so she kind of came closer to the, she stepped away from, no, I need to absolutely have kids, to, I'm not sure, maybe not. I will decide this at some point in the future. And I came from absolutely no kids. I want to adopt. And I recognized, part of this too, outside of that ideology, part of this is I don't feel like I would be ready and stable enough to have children. We don't own a house. I don't have a career track job that I'm actually happy with. At that point in time, I was burnt out and miserable in my job. And I don't feel like I've done all the things I want to do in my life before I have kids, such that, one, I'm the father I want to be once they come around, and two, I'm not trying to like get away from that dynamic to like go climb a mountain or go travel or go hang out with my buddies and feeling torn between the two. So if maybe that resolves itself a little bit, if I find myself in a place where I'm more ready, I'd be willing to consider doing that. But I'm not there yet now. I'm definitely not there yet now. So for now, it's still a no. Yeah. So we came to that, and we also just came to the realization that this might end our relationship at some point in the future.
Well, that's the concept of deal breaker, right? Yeah. Yeah.
But right now, it's not a deal breaker. And right now, we choose us, and we choose to hope, maybe have faith, that we'll figure it out. We've both kind of reached some flexibility.
Yeah.
And we're
you will
really
figure
sure
it out
about
because
this. Yeah.
You'll stay together or you'll split up, right? I mean, typically that's what's going to happen, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that.
And you're both capable of that. You know what I mean? So that's one of the bases of that kind of faith, is to recognize you don't know nobody knows, what's going to happen, how you're even going to feel. But if the faith part is just to say, this whole life business is somehow livable, apparently. So I guess we'll figure it out. Totally. Even though you don't quite know what that'll look like. So yeah. When people say, and this comes back to like, well, everything happens for a reason, or it'll work out for the best. I come back to, well, something will happen, and it will work out some way, right? And we will probably live on and figure it out, because humans are inherently resilient and adaptable. So there's no need to go grasping at certainty of this is going to be okay, or it'll work out for the best, or it will be okay, but not because I need that certainty, just because my lived experiences, like you said, you come out of despair and things actually turn out okay on the other end. Yeah. And, I love the sort of, I'm sure I'm going to be distorting a Buddhist point of view from my limited, my fairly ignorant knowledge, but I love the way, at least in my view of it, how the Buddhists handle that sort of issue, because I've only ever been to one Buddhist wedding. Have you ever been to a Buddhist wedding? Yeah, I've only ever been to one in my life. This was decades ago. A couple of friends of mine who had both grown up Christian. So, they weren't like, they hadn't grown up in Buddhist families, but they had become Buddhist. And so they were having this ceremony. This was in Vermont many years ago. And all I remember about it was very long, went on forever, but most of it was the sort of thing you would expect at a wedding. And they're talking about how we're so delighted that we're here surrounded by our family and friends, and mindful of the fact that we're going to die. We're so grateful to have found each other, and mindful of the fact that we're going to die. We're really looking forward to, setting up our household, and mindful of, like, every other word was mindful of the fact we're going to die, or every other sentence. And because it was that idea. Well, I remember hearing this from a Buddhist monk on a radio show. Yeah, how can you tell a Buddhist vacuum cleaner? It comes with no attachments. That's the idea. In other words, the Buddha's great idea was that the source of suffering is clinging to illusion. And
Yeah.
you know how Western religions deal with death. It's like as Jews, we don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about what happens later. Although there's stuff in the Talmud, and there's various stories, but we don't dwell on it like Catholics dwell on it a lot.
Mhm.
It's the heaven and hell thing, or purgatory or
Totally.
whatever. The
Yep.
Buddhists, I love what the Buddhists do with that, and I'm sure this is a caricature, but what the Buddhists do with that is say, "What are you worried about death for? What makes you think you're alive?" Because basically they're saying this whole individual self thing is an illusion.
Mhm.
It's a convenient illusion. It's like we're not individuals. We're all in this together. Before we die, after we die, this whole time thing is sort of hard to comprehend anyway. Ask a quantum
Oh my
physicist,
God.
It's
Mhm.
like, so, what the hell? There's something I find, especially I guess as an old guy, maybe this is part of it, comforting in the fact that no matter how well we try to do, guess what? We're all going to die anyway. And I don't mean that in a despairing sense. I just mean it's sort of, so, you so do the best you can because that's all we can expect to do anyway.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah, moving
Speaking
right
of
along.
despair, yeah, I
Yes.
mean, speaking of despair, we're coming up on the hour, and I want to ask a question that loops us back to what you can't unsee. So you
Mm,
said in the beginning, what I can't unsee is that despair is essentially like if not only does it pass from the ferment state, but there's what people may call post-traumatic growth, or there's meaning that blooms from this. You don't know it in the
yes.
moment. You want to punch somebody in the face if they tell you that in the moment, but it can happen. It can. It doesn't have to
Yeah.
happen, but it can happen. Can you talk about what you got from your time in despair in terms of
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
relationship skills that we just talked about? What makes it
Yeah.
possible, given what you went through, to sit with the anxiety that allows the intimacy?
Yeah. And I have experienced this and I've heard it from a lot of folks that, that sense of gratitude it can give you such a perspective on things that I remember. Well, here's another example of something I remember that wasn't about a deep despair thing, but a very painful incident. And with my ex and I, when we were having kids, and the very first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage at about 4 months, which is pretty late for a miscarriage. It's a very, very painful event, of course. I mean, painful for
Awful.
my then wife and painful for me, of course. And we were really sad. But I remember prior to that, we had these sort of annoying philosophical conversations about how we were going to raise kids and had disagreements about this or that or whatever, And after that, that just went away. It's like, oh, who gives a
Yeah.
shit?
Who gives a
It
shit?
just,
That's so true.
yeah, it put things in perspective. And that experience of despair, I mean, losing a marriage that was really, important to me and surviving it and going on and finding another life, which I never would have known that I would do, that puts a lot of stuff in perspective. So that perspective is the same perspective that lets you tolerate minor annoyances. Do you know what I mean? That lets you think of annoyances as just sort of funny because you're so delighted to have the blessing of being with someone, being with someone that you love and who loves you.
Yeah.
So that kind of perspective is what you get from going through despair, discovering that there are ways through it and coming out the other side.
Mhm.
That's beautiful. I had
Mm.
a dear friend who also lost a pregnancy and baby, lost a baby
Oh
at about
my, yeah,
5 months. And I
yeah.
remember her,
Uh,
we worked in state government together. It was awful, awful. She has since like worked with our local birthing hospital, like the major one in Rhode Island. 80% of babies are born from one hospital in Rhode Island. She's worked
Wow.
with them to create a wing for parents who are losing baby, like
Oh, yeah.
a
So they
wing,
don't
like
have to be in the
just a beautiful.
maternity wing. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh
So she's
God.
done
Yeah. I've heard that.
wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
But I remember we worked for state government, and there's a lot of like nonsense that happens in state government. And I remember her coming into some of her meetings like a couple months after she returned from her leave, and just saying things with a straight face at people who had a lot of power, and she just could care less. And I was like, I love this. I whatever the energy this is, I love this. And she goes, "You lose a baby, you say surprising things. You don't care
Yeah.
anymore."
Yeah.
I was like,
The
"Yep,
stuff that used to be
yep,
you'd so worry about, you
yeah,
learn to see, oh my God, I was worried about that. Well, what the hell?
yeah,
And then
yeah,
I've had so many people express gratitude for the struggle. This comes up in infidelity. When I've worked with lots and
yeah,
lots of couples where there's been some kind of betrayal, and when they can work through it, which together is separate, but often if they are able to stay together, and the only way they stay together is that things are better than they were before. That's how
yeah,
they end up staying together, and they're often so grateful for that. I remember one woman said at the end of this was before COVID. This was before I was doing telehealth, so we knew it was their last session because they were leaving town. They got a job somewhere else. One of them had, and the woman turned the guy had done the cheating, and the woman turned to the guy, and they'd worked with me for like a year and a half, and incredible work. Came to me, and they were just in such pain, and did such amazingly courageous work with each other. And she turned to him and said, "Hey, thanks for taking one for the team." And he said, "What do you
Mm.
mean by that?" And I said, "What do you mean by that?" She said, "Well, you're the one who has to feel guilty because, you right? Because you did the bad thing. You did the cheating." And we all smiled. This is sort of like, well, she's got a point, because he did appropriately, I think, appropriately. He thought appropriately, felt guilty. Of course, he knew it was a bad thing to have done. He had done an enormous amount of growing through this process and also addressed a serious drinking problem and all that kind of stuff. She had done so much growth herself. She was so grateful for it. She said, "We're not only are we better off than we ever have," she said to her husband, "but I'm better off with my kids. I'm better off with my coworkers. I'm better off with friends, because I'm not freaking out about stuff I used to freak out about." She was so grateful for that. That's why she said, "Hey, thanks for taking one for the
That's
team.
big.
We needed this,
Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
God. That's
Yeah.
big.
Yeah. Now, she didn't
That's
say
great.
thanks for cheating. I've never heard anybody say that. She'd say, "Well, thanks for, stepping out on me." She didn't say that. But she did say, thanks for, in effect, thanks for precipitating the crisis. It looks like we needed one, after
Mm.
the fact. Look how much better off we are.
That's beautiful. Thank you for the work you
Mhm.
do. That's really
Oh,
like
thank you.
Mm.
life-changing work. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the books you've
Well,
written.
thank you for, and I love, thank you for doing your podcast. I love talking about this stuff. So,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I I want to talk about you and your podcast. I mean, you have a whole
Yeah.
ecosystem of ways that you put yourself out into the world. Your podcast, and you talked about it. You said it's called Couples Therapy in 7 Words.
I got to tell
What
you
are
the 7 words, right?
what are the 7 words? Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know how many people are watching this as opposed to, there's the 7 words. We have it on a cup. We have merch. Actually, I don't sell the merch anymore, but there it is. Be
Be kind,
kind,
don't
don't
panic, have faith.
panic, and have faith. Yeah. And it's
Mhm.
so 3 principles, right? Be kind, don't panic, and have faith. You have to count "and" to get 7 words, because 6 words
Mhm.
would not do it. It has to be 7. So yeah, Jewish. Yeah. Seven's a big number, days of the week, all sorts of things.
Uh-huh.
So, but be kind, don't panic, and have faith. And the idea there is, and that's a formula I came up with decades ago when a colleague asked me. We were leaving a consultation group meeting. We must have been talking about couples therapy, and he just turned to me, and he knew it was sort of a silly question to ask on the way out the door, literally. But he said, "How do you do couples therapy anyway?" And I had given it some thought. And I first came up with a 5-word formula. I said, I think basically if you boil it all down and oversimplify, what I'm telling people is be kind and don't panic, because you can't be kind if you're panicking. And by kind, I don't just mean nice. Of course, we should all be nice. I mean kinship, that kind of kind.
Yeah.
Treat this person as someone on your team. Well, you're going to do that, but you can't do that if you're in a panic, especially if you're in a panic about whether they think you're kin or not. And
Mhm.
then, so I started sharing that with some of the folks I worked with, and they said, "Well, that's really interesting. I get that idea." It's like, yeah, we need to not panic. Tell me, how do you not panic? And they had me there because I'm thinking, oh shit, I don't have, I could just say, well, don't panic. Well, that helps, right? No. But what I recognize, so it's not so much an instruction as an observation. The folks who had faith in the way I was describing it earlier, the folks who looked at as meaningful, even if bad shit was happening, the folks where there had been cheating, and they would come in and say, the one who was cheated on would say, "I'm pissed, I'm hurt, but we're going to have to look at this because I know this person that is my partner is not inherently evil, and they're not crazy, and they're not stupid. So we better look at this, even though it's incredibly painful." That's faith. The people who could do that are the ones who are going to be okay, because that's the antidote to panic. It's like, well, this sucks, but we're going to have to see it as meaningful. The people who came in and would say, "Oh my God, this is terrible," and the one who cheated is saying, "I don't know, I was crazy, I was drunk, I'll never do it again, I just want to go back to how it was," and the other person saying, "You're damn right, and I'm going to monitor everything you do," and so on. That's
Mhm.
not faith. That's panic. And that they don't do as well. So a lot of the work is trying to convey or embody faith, that very faith. It's like, we're all doing the best we can here. That's another way of saying forgiveness, right? We're all doing the best we can here. We're valid people, even when we fucked up royally. We are valid people. And so if we can come from that perspective, then maybe we can actually deal with this hard stuff without panicking. Like, yeah, you did cheat on your wife, or you did cheat on your partner, or whatever. Maybe there's a way that you can actually look at what you did without having to dissolve into shame or, minimize or panic, and then say, oh shit, I was feeling resentful. That's not
Yeah.
pretty, but that's true, or whatever,
Huh.
Yeah. I love that.
In some
Good.
way, when people do like you said, a quote unquote bad thing, the at least the dichotomy, I mean, maybe this is again too simplistic, but the dichotomy of two different ways to think about it are: one, yes, you argue with it, you shame it, you say it shouldn't have happened that way, that's not what's, or you look at it and say, well, in some way, shape, or form, this makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's not what we agreed to do, maybe it's not what we ideally would have done, but this is the reality of what happened. And if you're saying reality is, I'm forgetting your exact words, but reality is as it should be, like it makes sense that reality is the way that it is, then we need to go figure out how it is that the reality of your
Yeah.
infidelity makes sense. And then there's something to learn there.
Yeah, yeah, and that of course is a tricky one, and you have to be careful with this and compassionate about it, because sometimes people will say, "I don't want to make meaning out of it. It was wrong. Don't make excuses." To look, there's a difference between making excuses for something in a moral sense and looking
Yeah.
at the context in which something happens. And the context everybody's involved in, So again, I'm not into blaming the victim when somebody has done something that is a betrayal of some kind. I'm not blaming the person who was betrayed.
Uh-huh.
It's not about blame even, but both of them were part of the context.
Yeah.
And they need to be able to look at that with courage, which again, that's what faith is all about. It's being able to look at that and say, this is painful, but we better look, as
Yeah.
opposed
Yeah.
to, trying to run away from it.
That's beautiful. You've mentioned, so we've got the podcast, you've got 4 books, you've got courses.
Mm.
Where can people find you, and what do you want to point them to, sort of as a way to get to know you?
Yeah, well, my website, brucechalmer.com.
Mm.
So BRUCECHALMER. There's no S on the end, so that's a different. I could tell you the Yiddish roots of the name, but that's all right. Actually, I will tell you. For those Jewish listeners who are noticing this, if you've ever heard of the wise men of Chalem, Chalem is an actual city, but the wise men of Chalem are this. It's a mythical city of in Yiddish folklore of fools. So my forebears evidently came from Chalem because they were the Chalamer. Chalamer was what they were. My grandfather got here, and when he became a citizen, the judge said, you can't spell Chalamer in English, so make it Chalmer, and that's how it got to be Chalmer. So that's, but brucechalmer.com to come around to your question, is how people can get a hold of me. And yeah, I'm really kind of touting the courses nowadays because I'm really excited about them because I just did them fairly recently. And I think I am told they are very helpful. And it's a way of starting on your own. You don't have to wait around to make an appointment with people. And they go very well with therapy. Certainly go very well with therapy with me, because it's that guy in those courses thinks just like I do. It's really astonishing. They go very well with that. But a lot of times it can save you time and effort in therapy by sort of crystallizing a lot of these ideas first, becoming familiar with them, so that when you go into therapy, you can have a language to talk about them that will actually get somewhere. We didn't get into, and I probably don't have time to get into, my little stick about it's not about communication. We didn't go there. You can have me back if you want.
I
But
think so.
there's a little little hint there. But that's, it's not about, it isn't about that. The whole thing about it's not about communication is about saying, if you try and get into an ideological approach, it tends not to work very well. And so that is also part of my shtick.
I
Great.
mean, we're
Thank
gonna
you.
have to do a round 2, because
Yeah.
one of the unasked questions is ideas open possibilities and ideologies shut down possibilities. What's there? And it sounds like that stood out to me, and it's not about communication, stood out to Kim. And what I'm hearing you say is they're related, and we need to have another episode in which you join us, and maybe your wife joins
Judy
us as
comes.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Judy comes.
Judy. We enjoy doing it together. We have been
Awesome.
on a number of podcasts together as well. So
Yeah.
we like doing that. Yeah.
Great.
Great.
Thanks, Bruce. This was such a
All right.
pleasure.
Yeah. Well, for me too.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So much fun. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, Pancho. Good night.